Okay, this week I do promise to finish up with chapter 13 of Acts. So, I made a mistake this morning. I walked out without my glasses, so I'm going to... They might work better than what I got on right now. Fortunately, I've got my father's large print Bible, so I think I'll be okay. So we're looking at Acts. Yeah.
They're not working very good.
It is very necessary. Oh, you're getting a really large print? No, you guys, you're a hoot. All right, I think where we left off last time, Paul and Barnabas had gone into the synagogue. They had been invited to speak if they had anything to say, and Paul took advantage of the opportunity to proclaim the gospel using their own tradition, their own format within the synagogue worship system at the time, and he grasped it and seized it and used it as an opportunity to declare Jesus Christ as the Messiah to these people. He uses their own background, their own knowledge of Hebrew history to lay out the case that Jesus Christ was the promised Messiah. He met all the benchmarks, all the signs, all of the things that the Bible said that Messiah would exhibit, all the things whereby they would know he'd be the Messiah, and these are important. If a man's going to claim, I am the Messiah, there are certain criteria he's going to have to meet. Because apart from that, anybody can stand up and say, I am the Messiah. But if you don't meet the criteria, we are under no obligation to believe that person. And we have people running around now claiming to be Messiah. Who is this guy? Where in the world is this guy at? He claims that he's some sort of a faith healer kind of a guy. He's in another country. I don't know if you've been following him, but he's been arrested for fraud and different kinds of things. But he's claiming to be some sort of a Messiah. And, well, he can't possibly be because obviously he's not Jewish. I'm okay, Fred. I'm fine. I'm okay. If you need it, go ahead and use it. Yeah. So, anyways, now that Fred has thrown off my thought pattern, I'll have to go back and start over again. No. So, anyways, anybody can claim to be Messiah, but the Messiah is going to have certain characteristics, certain benchmarks, certain signposts. And like I went over last time, if the president's going to come and visit us, you're going to know the president's coming to visit us because there are going to be certain milestones that are going to be present to know that it's really the president coming, that it's not somebody coming to pretend to be him. And how much more important is Messiah? So if Messiah is going to come and Messiah has been promised to the Jewish people, there are going to be signs that when the man claims to be Messiah, he's going to fulfill everything. And in the Old Testament prophecies were very clear where he was going to come from, the kind of works he'd be performed. He would be called the Son of God. He would have the forerunner. He would have all of these things. And so Paul uses this and lays it out. Jesus Christ is your Messiah. He is the one you're looking for. And you rejected him. But nevertheless, even though you rejected him, it was still according to God's plan. And he declares to them, in Jesus now is forgiveness of sins. The problem with the Jews, as we have said over and over again, is that they were not looking for the biblical Messiah. They were looking for a Messiah they had created in their own mind. They were looking for a militaristic hero kind of a Messiah that was going to throw off the shackles of Rome. They weren't looking for a Messiah who would come along and throw off the shackles of sin and pay the penalty and bring about reconciliation to God the Father. That's the Messiah Jesus was, and that's not the kind of Messiah that they wanted. I mean, not only did they not, even if he were the Messiah, that wasn't the kind of Messiah they wanted, and they were going to reject him because he's not what they're looking for. They're looking for this political figure rather than this religious figure who was going to pay the penalty of sin. And the Old Testament, especially in the books of Moses, are replete with the typology of Christ and the idea of substitutionary payment for sin and vicarious atonement and things like that. They weren't looking for that. So, and in verse 42 it says, "And when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath." So it's clear that in this group at the synagogue there are Gentiles. They have heard the message, and they have asked that Paul and Barnabas preach it again the next. What are you doing, Fred? The next Sabbath. Say what? All right then. You're nothing but a troublemaker this morning. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the class. So they are wanting to have. They seem to be, especially the Gentiles, more so than the Jews. They're hungry to hear more of what Paul and Barnabas have been preaching, and clearly the Holy Spirit, I think, has been working in their hearts and preparing them for this gospel message. And so now, when the congregation was broken up, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. So, as they're breaking up, we have evidence that these men are. Many of these men have already been saved, I think possibly as a result of the preaching of Barnabas and Paul. First of all, that they were following Paul and Barnabas. I think following them, perhaps they wanted to continue to hear more. They were interested in what they had to say, and they had attached themselves to Paul and Barnabas. And Paul and Barnabas persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. So I think this suggests that they had already experienced and tasted of God's grace. And so these are probably the earliest converts in this city, and so we have, and really this city here is it's in an area called Galatia. So when Paul writes his book to the Galatians, it's basically to these groups of people who have been saved. I think probably during this first missionary trip and the subsequent one. So then, so in verse 44 now, we see that the next Sabbath day, almost the whole city together came, let's see, on the next Sabbath day came almost the whole city together to hear the word of God. So that we have we have our first citywide campaign, I guess, if you could put it that way. The whole city is interested, and I can see, back in the day, they don't have the internet, they don't have television, they don't have radio, so they got these new guys coming in with a new message, and it's going to spark their interest. It's at the very least, it's something to do. So the city wants to come in, and I'm sure from the one Sabbath to the next, the word has gone through the whole city about the things that Paul and Barnabas are preaching, and people are at least curious to hear what's going on and to hear what's being said. So, what we have here in verse 44, we have that the city comes together. In verse 45, but when the Jews saw the multitudes, they were filled with envy and spake against those things which were spoken by Paul, contradicting and blaspheming. We have Paul and Barnabas preaching there in verse 48. We have, and when the Gentiles heard this, they were glad and glorified the word of the Lord, and as many as were ordained to eternal life believed. So in verse 48, we have the Gentiles responding positively to the message of Paul and Barnabas. And in verse 49, and the word of the Lord was published throughout all the region. And then so the gospel is now spreading throughout the region. So the city comes together in 44. In 45, Paul and Barnabas preach the gospel. 48, the Gentiles respond. And in 49, the word begins to spread.
I think it's interesting in 46 that the Jews said, you're unworthy of everlasting life.
Yeah.
They would put themselves
And there, you know, the Old Testament has several passages where the whole objective of the Jewish nation was to be a light unto the Gentiles. They were to represent God to the nations of the world, but the Jews they turned it and twisted it. They wanted God for themselves. They didn't want anybody else to have anything to do with it. And then the God that they were worshiping wasn't the God of the Bible. They created their own God that they were worshiping. So in where was I at? Verse 45. But when the Jews saw the multitudes, they were filled with envy. Envy. I think envy is one of the 7 deadly sins, and it is universally destructive. Now, in the Bible, I found this word envy to be interesting, and I wanted to study it out a little bit. And I wanted to contrast, I think, the words jealousy and envy. Are they the same? Are jealousy and envy synonymous? And I think not. Jealousy is not always an evil thing. In fact, the Old Testament, Exodus 23, Exodus 34:14, Deuteronomy 4:24, Joshua 24:19, Zechariah 1:14, Joel 2:18, they all describe God as being a jealous God. Well, jealousy can't be a negative thing when it's referred to God's character and attributes. It's a part of God's attribute and character that he's jealous. But what does jealousy mean in this particular case? I mean, jealousy can be good, it can be evil. But in this case, I think it's right and it's even holy to jealously protect that which is yours. And that's what God is talking about. He is jealous to protect his people and to protect their worship of him, to protect them from the worship of idols, and some of the commentaries I looked at compare this to a marriage relationship. It is right to be jealous of your marital relationship and to do everything possible to protect it and preserve it. And I think, you know, if one spouse or the other comes to the other one says, hey, honey, I don't think you're spending too much time talking to that particular person, or, you know, you're in danger of this or that, we ought to take it properly and say, you're right. I am totally impressed with Vice President Pence and what he has done. You know, he will not go out to dinner with a woman without his wife being present. He is jealously protecting his marriage with his wife. But what does today's society has done to that? They've mocked him for it. They excoriate him for it. How, you know, they take something which is good, a jealous protection of his relationship with his wife, and they turn it into something that's, you know, something to be mocked and derided. But and then Paul uses the word jealousy as a fatherly affection. If you want to go to 2 Corinthians 11:2. He says, for I am jealous over you with godly jealousy, for I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. So we again have this allusion to the marital relationship of Paul having a godly jealousy towards the people that he has ministered to. It's a loving affection kind of a jealousy. It is a jealousy that promotes that and promotes concern for their welfare and their well-being, and it's a sort of a fatherly or a spousal kind of a love for someone else. That kind of jealousy, I believe, is, you know, the Bible clearly teaches that it's acceptable. Nevertheless, also the Bible covers the other side too, in that jealousy can be a source of evil and sin. But I think the difference between the two, as I see it, is jealousy is a desire, at least as it's used in this context, is a desire to protect that which is rightfully yours. But envy is evil, and in the Bible, wherever you see envy, it's always evil, and it is desiring what others have. a wicked, sinful desire for things that other people have. And I think envy really it flies in the face of God's sovereignty. God has sovereignly ordained that we all have different stations and statuses in life. We all have different economic situations. God's, to say, I don't like where I'm at and I'd rather be where you're at, is to deny God's sovereignty. God has put us where we're at, and Paul often says, be content with your wages. Be happy with what you're at. God is in control of everything. So, but evil, the envy is evil. It flies in the face of God's sovereignty, and envy is always destructive. Go through the history of the Bible. We begin with Satan's rebellion over God's character. Satan was filled full of envy and puffed himself up against God. Satan, he sought to destroy the intimate relationship that man and woman had with God in the Garden of Eden. It was his envy, and he succeeded in destroying that. But then, God made a way for us to be restored in spite of Satan's best efforts. It was envy that motivated Cain to rise up and murder Abel. And as I go down through these things, what I see most often in the Bible is that envy is always envious of, in these cases, one person's relationship with God. They're envious of the relationship they have with God, and they hate it. Cain was envious of Abel. Abel's sacrifice was proper and right and acceptable to God. Cain's was not. And so Cain, out of envy, rose up and murdered his brother. Only 4 people on the face of the earth, as far as we can tell from the scriptures, and already 25% have been wiped away. So very, very early on, that's how destructive envy was. It was Joseph's brothers, their envy, that resulted in at least a temporary setback in Joseph's life. And they were envious, I think, first of all, over his relationship with their father. And Abraham serves as a type of God in many cases. And I think they were also envious of Joseph's relationship with God. Joseph's life was a life exhibited by a lifelong character devoted to Christ. I mean, not to Christ, but to God. He worshiped God. He didn't just start becoming a faithful follower of God when he was in Egypt. I think he was a faithful follower of God from the earliest moments of his life. And and he exhibited that when he interprets his dreams and things like this. And his brothers are envious of him, and so they set out to destroy him, or to at least make Isaac. No, Jacob. Help me out, Jacob. He sets out to make Jacob think that Joseph has been murdered, and causes Jacob to have a lifelong grieving over the loss of his son until they're reunited in Egypt. It's Saul, out of envy. I mean, I think he's envious of the promise of God to David to one day take his throne. Saul is envious over what God has promised to David, and it motivates him to try to hunt David down and kill him. Daniel. Those men were envious of Daniel's relationship with God, first of all, because they were going to try to trap him in his worship of God and send him to the lion's den. So they're envious of his position, as the position he had within the Babylonian government, but they're envious of his love and relationship with his God, and they tried to use that against him. But God preserved him and turned that envy back on their own heads. We have the same thing with Haman. Haman and Mordecai. Haman is just filled with envy against Mordecai and against the Jews, broadly speaking. Comes up with a plot to try to destroy them. And this is motivated by his envy. And when the Jews were envious of Jesus when he came to earth, they're envious, first of all, that he claimed to be God's son. Envious of the fact that Jesus was drawing more and more people to himself and to his message, and putting them in a position where the people listening to the messages and the teaching of Jesus and contrasting them with what the Pharisees are teaching are seeing a stark contrast. They're seeing a man who genuinely follows and loves the Lord, contrast it against a group who say they do but don't really. They ask them, they make them do things, but they themselves are hypocrites. And the people see this, and they become envious of the following Jesus is drawing to himself, and the result of their envy is the crucifixion of Christ. But yet it works to God's good because it's part of God's plan. And I think that in Acts chapter 13, it does tell us that Jews become envious. What are they envious of? These Jews are envious of the Gentiles' relationship with their God. Their God is not for the Gentiles. Their God is for themselves. And the fact that these Gentiles are now followers of Christ, and they can't stand this. They can't stand it. And it drives them crazy and drives them to do wicked things. And really, if you look at probably, I would say probably without exception, every problem that happens in a church, every church split, every church argument, every issue coming up in a church has something to do with envy somewhere. Somebody's envious of something, and their envy drives them. And like I said, envy is always destructive, and if left unchecked, that envy will destroy a church. It will cause it to split, over silly stuff. So then the scriptures tell us that the Jews, out of their envy, they begin to resist Paul and Barnabas. They tell us that they speak against Paul. Let's see if I can find it here. Oh, not in Acts anymore. Verse 45. But when the Jews saw the multitudes, they were filled with envy and spake against those things which were spoken by Paul, contradicting and blaspheming. So they're speaking against and contradicting the message of Paul and Barnabas. They contradict his message, and they are blaspheming. The Bible doesn't tell us what form this blasphemy is occurring, but perhaps not against Paul himself, but against God. And I have no doubt that they are blaspheming Jesus Christ, because that is the message. And if you listen, even in modern Jewish commentaries, the things they say about Jesus are blasphemous. I mean, they will not even, a devout Jew will not even mention his name. They'll refer to him as that man, or the blasphemer, or whatever. They won't mention him by name. And in so doing, they still blaspheme. And I'm sure that all of that has its roots way back in the beginning, when the early Jews, the early Pharisees, they were doing everything they could to blaspheme Jesus. He wasn't the Son of God. He was the illegitimate son of Mary and some Roman soldier or whatever. I've heard that one. But they're blaspheming. I think the focus of their blaspheming is Jesus himself, who he is, his deity, and everything else. And I heard the buzzer. So, are there any questions?